Okay, well, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. On behalf of the Illinois Small Business Development Center at Chinese Mutual Aid Associations, welcome to today's webinar on running a small business, a legal perspective. We are so honored that today's session is presented by the Chinese American Bar Association. Just a few housekeeping items. The Illinois SBDC at CMA is part of a nationwide network that promotes entrepreneurship and small business growth. If you would like to receive one-on-one, no-cost business advising, I'll send you the registration link to sign up in the chat box. And just a reminder that this session is being recorded, and we'll send out the presentation and recording at a later time. And finally, if you have questions, please submit them in the chat box. We'll be monitoring that throughout the presentation. But please note that this webinar does not constitute legal advice, but is intended for general informational purposes only. Next slide, please. I'd like to formally introduce the organization, Chinese American Bar Association. This organization was formed in 1986 and is the first local bar association of attorneys of Asian descent in the Chicagoland area. Today, CABA continues to be a forum and resource for networking and learning, organizing and sponsoring events of interest to its members, providing public services to the local Chinese and Pan-Asian community. If you'd like more information, you can visit cabachicago.org. And then also, if you'd like to get in touch with CABA, you can email them at cabachicago@gmail.com, and we'll put that in the chat box as well. Next slide, please. I'm very honored to introduce our panel of superstars today. We are so grateful for CABA's partnership and everything they do for the community. CMA's very own associate board member and CABA President Ivy Lee is here with us today. Ivy has served as general outside counsel for small to medium-sized businesses, representing owners in corporate transactions and operations. Our community is so grateful for Ivy's leadership, guidance, and the tremendous impact she has made for so many families across Chicago. And next, I'm very delighted to introduce every Asian parent's dreams child, CABA board member Shang Xiao. Shang was on the dean's list at University of Chicago for his bachelor's and graduated from Harvard Law School. And currently, he serves as an associate in the real estate and banking and corporate finance groups. And finally, I'm very honored to introduce our next lawyer who has paved the way for so many of our millennial attorneys. And over the years, I witnessed firsthand her dedication, commitment, and service in uplifting the community and building a better tomorrow. And what's amazing is the positive impact that she's made. She's done it in just a few years. So please join me in welcoming the 2020 CABA Presidential Awardee and immediate past President, Jean Liu. Madam President, the mic is yours.
Hi, everyone. First of all, Tommy and CMAA, thank you so much for having us here. Thank you for that introduction, Tommy. I wasn't quite sure you were talking about me. It seemed very foreign to me. With that all being said, I wanted to introduce a little bit more about each of mine, Ivy's, and Shang's individual practices. I myself am an attorney with a wide litigation and advisory practice. I regularly counsel businesses with respect to contract disputes, negotiations, privacy issues, and employment law. In addition, I do litigate insurance coverage disputes. As Tommy had mentioned, I am the immediate past president of the Chinese American Bar Association, and I am currently the second vice president of the Asian American Bar Association. As for Ivy, she's a corporate attorney who provides general legal counsel to small and mid-sized businesses. Her practice includes business formation, dissolution, contract negotiation, and the purchase and sale of companies. Prior to practicing law, she was a professional translator specializing in Mandarin and English translations for law firms and international corporations. As Tommy mentioned, she is the current president of CABA and an associate board member of CMAA. Shang is an attorney focusing on real estate and financing matters. His practice includes real estate purchases and sales, leasing, in both real estate and general corporate financing. Shang is a graduate of Harvard Law School and the University of Chicago. Prior to law school, Shang worked at a nonprofit focused on assisting small businesses in Queens, New York. He is also a board member of CABA. If I could get the next slide, please. And this is just something Tommy had touched on. We do want to emphasize a disclaimer. The information provided in this presentation does not and is not intended to constitute legal advice or give rise to an attorney-client relationship. All information, content, and materials available on this presentation are for general information purposes only. Information in this presentation may not constitute the most up-to-date legal or other information. As you might know, the law is constantly changing. This presentation may contain links to third-party websites, and these links are just for your convenience. We do not make any representations regarding the accuracy or the content of such links. We strongly recommend that you retain and consult with an attorney or any other applicable professional advisor before engaging in any transactions or making any business decisions. And the next slide, please. So our goal of this webinar is really to talk about various topics that a business owner might be interested in. And we've more or less organized this presentation into 3 different parts: formation of your business operations, and potential exposure. Next slide, please. So that all being said, I'm going to ask Ivy a question, which is probably a question that many of you guys have, which is, what is the first thing that an aspiring business owner should do?
So we're gonna go through how you pick a name for your business. Melanie, can you queue up the website for the Illinois Secretary of State? So if we're thinking about starting a business, first thing you need to do is check and see if the name that you want to use is available. Most of you will probably be forming a corporation or an LLC. So this is the website from the Illinois Secretary of State where you could look up an existing corporation or LLC, and this is, a good way to find out if the name has been taken. So if you could scroll down a little bit, Melanie, and let's just pretend that we want to start a company called Star Coffee. So hit submit, and then under search, type in Star Coffee. Yep, and then just continue. As you can see, there is a bunch of companies called Star Coffee of different things. So this would tell you that this is probably not a great idea unless you want to do like Star Coffee of Chicago, that would be a available name. But in order to differentiate yourself a little bit more, it might be a good idea to think of something a little different. So hit return to search screen, Melanie. And then go submit again, and let's try the name Blue Star Coffee and see what happens. Yep. And as you can see, it doesn't match any record. So this means that there's no existing businesses that have a similar name. So in this scenario, you could go through and check and see all the type of names that you're interested in and see if any of those would work for you. When you click into an existing business, it will provide information on, when it was founded, who's operating it, and so forth. So you can find out more information about the business. Let's go back to the slides now. Thank you, Melanie. So as you can see, there are 2 links on the slide. There's one for LLCs and corporations, which is the one that we were just at. There's a different one if you're thinking of starting a partnership. And also if you're thinking of doing a sole proprietorship, but you will want to do a DBA, which is you're trying to do business as a different name. So for example, my name is Ivy Lee. If I want to do business as Ivy Lee, I don't need to file any additional paperwork. But if I want to do business as Ivy's Translation Company, then I need to search and make sure that name's available before I can use it. Okay, next slide, please. So after you have decided on a name, you probably want to decide on a business image. Most companies have a logo. So the important thing here is to make sure that your logo isn't confusingly similar to another existing business. So in this scenario, you can see that there are 2 logos. One's for Starbucks coffee, and then there's a Star Prea coffee. So in this scenario, the Star Prea coffee was ruled as too similar to the Starbucks coffee logo because it's the same general layout, the same-ish color, and it's also both trying to sell coffee. So if it was Star Prea bookstore, maybe it would have been okay. But because it's similar and trying to sell the same-ish products or services, in this scenario, it's too similar. So when you're thinking about creating a business image, you want to make sure that you're not too similar to something that already started so that you would not be liable for any trademark issues. Next, we're going to move on to Shang, who will talk about the types of business entities that you should use. So Melanie, next slide.
Sure. So, Ivy just discussed a couple of different types of businesses in passing. So there are corporations, LLCs, different kinds of partnerships. So the next question is, well, what sort of business entity is best for me? And this is really not a one-size-fits-all consideration. So we're going to give some examples of different types of businesses that might want to use one form or another. But generally, there are some sorts of questions that people usually think about when deciding what kind of business entity to use. So here's a kind of a quick, simple list of those sorts of questions to think about. One is, are there going to be multiple owners, or are you going to be on your own? The second is, are the owners and managers of the business the same or different people? Meaning sometimes there are owners who have invested some money in a business, but they're not really involved in the day-to-day management. So there are different types of entities that might suit one situation over another. What are the citizenship statuses of the business owners? Will you eventually want to attract outside investors or go public? And lastly, how much risk of liability is there to your business model? So as we'll see, there's some types of businesses that are probably inherently more risky than others. And in those situations, you might want to consider one type of business entity over another for that reason. Next slide, please. So the first thing we'll think about is a sole proprietorship. That's essentially you're a one-person show. The catch here is that you do face some liability, because if you did something wrong, no one here will do anything wrong, but if you did something wrong and you get sued or face some sort of penalty, you personally are at risk instead of your business being at risk. So that's sort of the drawback. On the plus side, you're on your own, so you're making all the decisions. There are no kind of like state filing fees, no annual fees. So just now when we looked at the Secretary of State site, if we clicked on one of those businesses, we could see when they were formed, whether they paid their annual fees or not. All of that wouldn't be necessary in a sole proprietorship. But I think the liability risk is something that should be considered seriously. One example of a situation where sole proprietorship might actually make sense is, say you're a wedding or a special occasion photographer. So, you're on your own, you don't really have any employees, assuming you're a US citizen and can pay taxes personally, because as a sole proprietorship, you'll be paying taxes as an individual on your business. Assuming you can do that, a sole proprietorship might make sense, just because the risk is relatively low. You're not signing a lease, you're working out of your home, and you have some equipment, but generally the contracts are not, tens of thousands of dollars, and you can kind of still stay on your own and keep decision making with yourself. Next slide, please. So another one that's frequently used is a limited liability company. In this case, you can have a single person LLC, but more often in the small business context, this will be when there are multiple owners. So some factors to consider are how many people will jointly own the business. Are the owners and operators the same people? So with an LLC, you can have a manager operated LLC where, one person might be kind of the day-to-day person, and then the actual investors, they could be the same people, but there could also be people who, you're drawing money from, and they'll get a share of the profits, but they don't actually manage the LLC on a day-to-day basis. So, that's one reason why people use LLCs, if they want to bring in other people who might not be directly involved every day. Will there be employees? Will you need to sign a lease, buy expensive equipment installments, and have long-term supply contracts? So this goes to the idea of liability being an issue. So if you have some sort of long-term contract that's kind of like high dollar figure. So a lease, for example, is an example of a contract that's a little longer term and might have a little more money at stake. To limit liability so that your landlord might not be able to go directly after you, an LLC is something that could mitigate that sort of risk. There's a filing fee to form the business. So when we did the search for names, you saw a few LLCs. Those are all LLCs that have officially filed and registered with the state, and they'll pay an annual filing fee, an annual report fee every year. And then finally, as far as taxes, by default, the taxation is passed through in the sense that, and that means that you end up paying taxes once because the money flows through to your individual personal income taxes. You can elect to be taxed as a corporation. And I think that would entail a different rate, but before making any decision on that, it's advisable to consult with a tax expert. Next slide. And just to cover a few other sorts of businesses, I think that the two that we want to go into detail on are sole proprietorships and LLCs, but some other sorts of businesses are corporations and partnerships, specifically limited liability partnerships. So corporations generally fall into two categories, C Corps and S Corps. C Corps are good if you're kind of getting very big and you're looking to secure funds from outside investors. There's double taxation, meaning the corporation is taxed and then the distributions coming out of the corporation are also taxed as personal income for those individuals. S Corps are a little smaller. They're limited to 100 shareholders and everyone must be a US citizen or a permanent resident. And those taxes are passed through, so that just gets taxed to the individual shareholders. And finally, LLPs generally are used more for professional organizations like accounting firms and law firms, and they have pass-through taxes too that go directly to the individual. Next slide, please. I'm going to pass it on to Ivy to speak more about Secretary of State filings.
So as we've talked about, if you're a sole proprietorship, that means it's just you and you don't have any partners. You're acting on your own behalf. You don't need to file any official paperwork unless you're trying to operate under a different name. So if I'm trying to be Ivy's translation company, then I need to file something with the Illinois Secretary of State saying that I want to do business as Ivy's translation company. For the LLC, you will, and the corporations, you both need to file documents with the Illinois Secretary of State, and you can do that on their website. The current filing fees are $150 for each of them. The LLC has a document called the Articles of Organization, and the corporations have to file something called the Articles of Incorporation. You'll need to fill in things like who are the partners, who are, how many shares you're going to want to issue, things like that. You will also have to do an annual filing every year for both of these kinds of businesses. So you will need to include information every year on who the current managers or directors of the company are and their contact information. Next slide, please. Another thing you need to do before your business can start operating is to obtain an employer identification number. So this is kind of like a business's social security number. It's a unique 9-digit number assigned by the IRS, and you will need it to open a bank account, hire employees, file business tax returns. Sometimes when you sign contracts, they want to run a credit check. It's like a social security number for the business. Next slide. Okay, so now we want to talk about operating agreements and bylaws. So an LLC needs to have an operating agreement, and a corporation needs to have bylaws. These documents are not one-size-fits-all documents, so we would highly recommend that you talk with a lawyer in drafting these documents. It's important to we're going to go over some of the questions that you should, that these documents should address. And I would typically recommend that you have these documents drafted before, if not soon after you form the business, so that there's no questions about, who owns the business, for example. So some of the first questions are ownership questions, like how many owners are in the business? How many % does each owner own? Sometimes I had people come to me 2 years later and say, I invested $4,000 and the other person invests $6,000, but I do more work on the company. So how many percent do I own? I'm like, what do you have written down? So you need to make sure that you guys agreed upon that in the beginning and have something written down. How can an owner sell his or her share in the of interest in the company? Are there any restrictions on who can own, who an owner can sell to? And is there a right of first refusal? So these questions address things like, well, if I own a business and with Jean, and I decided to sell my share to Shang, is that okay? Like, you know, with Jean wants a right of first refusal, which means that under the same conditions, she gets to buy me out first. Or is there restrictions like I can only transfer to, you know, my family, direct family members and existing shareholders. So you want to make sure what's your comfort level with your shareholders just transferring their share to other people. Is there an appraisal required when an owner wants to sell his or her share? Because third-party appraisals cost money, but at the same time, you have a third-party objective opinion on how much a company is worth. So, you know, it's questions that you might want to think about. Next slide, please. In terms of governance, there are some questions like who has the right to vote? There are different types of stocks. So some stocks has the right to vote and others don't. So you guys want to make sure that it's very clear from the beginning what your agreement is. What constitutes a quorum? So a quorum is the minimum amount of shareholder representation required to make a decision valid. So for example, if I own 60% of the company and Jean owns 40%, and we decide that, you know, you have to have a quorum of 70% or more for a decision to be effective, both of us will need to be present at the meetings for that meeting decision to be effective. If it was just me, then I can't make any decisions on my own. Another example would be like talking about who the managers, members, directors, or officers of the company are and how you elect them. So you want to make sure that you have agreement on how these things are to be addressed. Frequencies of director and shareholder meeting. The Illinois Corporation Act requires at least annual meetings, but you know, in your operating agreement and bylaws, you can write out more details about how that's supposed to happen. If the owners and operators are different, what are the inspection rights of the owners? You don't want the owners to come knocking on the door every single day so that you can't operate your business, but you also want to make sure that they have sufficient information about what's going on. And you know, what percentage of ownership is required to approve major decisions? What constitutes major decisions? So things like, you know, how many percent is required to, for example, if I own a restaurant and the restaurant owns a building, you know, selling the building that the restaurant is located probably would constitute a major decision that would require, you know, unanimous maybe decision from the shareholder. So just things like that you want to walk through. Next slide, please. In terms of operations, some of the questions include how often can distributions be made to shareholders? How much can they be? Who decide? You know, you don't want to distribute all the funds, then the company can't operate. So there's, what about if there's conflict of interest? Can I decide to just hire my sister and her company to do things? Like, do I need approval from my partners before I can do that? Who gets to sign checks and bank documents on behalf of the company? You may not want everyone to be able to do it. So you need to decide who can and how much debt can the company incur before ownership approval is required. Maybe I don't want, you know, my managers to go and get a $5 million loan without talking to me first. Finally, when it comes to dissolution, winding down the business, you know, you want to talk about what are the necessary steps to dissolve it and how are any, you know, excess funds distributed after a company's closed. Okay, next slide, please. after you have your bylaws and your operating agreement drafted, it's important that this is not done. You still have to maintain your records. Some things that triggers your record keeping duties include things like if there's new investments and there's change of ownership, you need to update to see, you know, who owns how much % of the company. An example would be I had a client who in the beginning he owned 60% and his partner owned 40% because, you know, that's how much money they each invested. And then he decided to deed a building that he owns over to the company. And he didn't change the records. What he wasn't realizing is this means that the company now owns the building and he owns 60% of the building and his partner owns 40% of the building. He thought he owned 100% of the building, but that's not how it works. So in that scenario, he should have, you know, recalculated how much each person owns based on the additional value of the building. Another example would be if there are changes in officers, directors, and managers, and these should also be updated in the annual filings that the company has to do every year. And just to protect the management or the ownership, there should be written records showing how large decisions are made. So for example, if we sell large assets owned by the company outside of the normal course of business. So for example, I'm a restaurant. I don't normally sell buildings, but if I decide to sell the building that I own, we probably want to write down, you know, we had a meeting, who was present, did anyone say no? That way, if, you know, years down the line, someone decides to dispute it, you can pull out the record and say, you know, we talked about it, these people were present and they agreed, you know. Same thing with like possible conflict of interest transactions. If I decide to buy a bunch of stuff from my sister's company, it's good to show that, you know, my partners Jean and Shang were there and they didn't say no, you know, that way they can't sue me years later. Okay, next slide. We're going to transfer it over to Shang to talk about licensing and permits.
Sure. So, you know, I think up to this point, we've been primarily focused on formation of the company. What are sort of the first steps you take? So you find a name, you find a logo, you register with the Secretary of State if you need to. You know, hopefully you'll create a business, an operating agreement early on. So the next section of our presentation is going to start transitioning into, you know, what do you actually do to operate the business, and how do you actually, you know, on a day-to-day basis, like the sort of day-to-day things that matter when you're operating that business. So the first thing we thought about is potentially needing licensing and permits. So depending on the sort of business that you are running, you know, you might need local Chicago permits. And this is the sort of thing that actually can vary from state to state and city to city. So for anyone who's not in Chicago, you know, it's advised that you consult a legal professional who is more familiar with regulations on the ground. But so Chicago has a pretty handy website, which I don't think we need to visit now, but it's in the chat, that kind of lists out for the sort of business that you're thinking about starting, what permits and what fees might be required, and the specific section of Chicago's municipal code that covers that business. So it's definitely advised before starting any sort of business to check this out and, you know, to kind of learn what licensing might be required before going forward. Next slide, please. The next thing that we thought, you know, would be necessary is to think about locations. So, you know, if you're working out of home, that's one thing, but a lot of businesses will either own or lease office space or store space or whatever their workspace is. So, you know, locations, real estate's generally owned or leased. Starting with owned, Ivy kind of mentioned this in passing, but when you own a property, you need to make sure you have a recorded deed. And a deed is just, you know, something like, it's like monopoly, like saying like, I own this property, but that needs to be recorded in the county records. And that is sort of who, you know, officially owns that property. So in Ivy's example, you know, the business is the one that was on the recorded deed and listed in the county records as the owner of the property. When that business changed hands, the ownership of the business became essentially the ownership of the property. But because that property was not held in the name of that individual owner, but rather in the company, when the company changed hands, so did the property. So basically, whatever's on the records as the owner is the owner. And if you're buying a property, you need to make sure that you do record a deed in your own name or in your business's name, and make sure you take that last step of doing so, because that's who officially owns it. Title insurance, I don't want to get into too much detail because it's very complicated, but essentially title insurance is unlike other sorts of insurance. Most insurance usually is to protect you against future events. Title insurance is something you buy when you buy a property that protects you against past events. So a title company will do their own search of who has owned the property, whether there are any other claims to the property, and they'll insure you against other people claiming that they own the property or own some portion of it. So if you're buying property, it's usually recommended to get some form of title insurance. As far as leasing, again, I think identity of who the tenant is very important. So, and primarily for liability reasons, but if you have a sole proprietorship, you're probably going to be the one on the lease. But sometimes I'll see people who have limited liability companies, who have LLCs, but they'll sign the lease as themselves, as an individual. So if they fall behind on rent, the landlord can then go after that person individually, as opposed to just going after the company. So make sure you know who you're signing your lease as. And then just a few specific leasing issues. Rent structure. Different leases have different kinds of rent structures, but usually there's a base rent that's just a flat fee that you pay every month. And then sometimes you'll be asked to pay some portion of operating expenses or taxes. So that's like, let's say it's a big office building and there are 10 tenants, and you have an office that takes up 15% of the space. So your office is slightly bigger than everyone else's. You might be asked to pay 15% of the landlord's costs for operating, like janitorial or like lobby, electricity, things like that, and real estate taxes. Percentage rent is slightly different. Percentage rent comes up most often in retail context, but that's a situation where the landlord will actually take some small percentage of your sales in exchange for having a lower base rent. So they'll charge you they're almost putting some skin in the game themselves, because they'll end up taking maybe 6% of your sales over X number of dollars. And in exchange, like your base rent might be lower than it usually would be. Other things to watch out for when signing lease are landlord rights. So sometimes landlords can relocate you within a building. If they want to lease your space to somewhere else, that would be in a lease, and it's something to watch out for. And then consent rights. If you want to sublease, usually you'll need a landlord's consent. If you want to assign the lease to someone else or get out of it completely, you'll need landlord consent. And it's also important to be clear on what exactly the landlord is responsible for in your building. So what they're responsible for repairing, what you're responsible for repairing, and janitorial and maintenance sort of obligations they have. Just really quickly on COVID and force majeure, because I think that came up a lot in the spring. So force majeure provisions might cover pandemics, but they usually don't excuse the payment of rent. The idea being that even like you still have access to your bank account, even if you might not have access to the building anymore. So force majeure actually usually forgives the landlord more than it does the tenant. So the landlord could say, well, I can't repair this because I'm not allowed to open my building because of COVID. That usually doesn't excuse the tenant from paying rent. The caveat is that this is still obviously a recent development, and the law is changing around these things. So if one is in that situation or a future situation like this, it's best to consult with an attorney. Next slide, please. I'm going to turn it over to Jean to talk about some other operations issues.
Yeah, so before I go on, we're about 2/3 of the way through our presentation. We do have a lot more to cover. I'm encouraging everyone to please ask any questions you think might be relevant in the chat box, and hopefully we might be able to work it in while we go through the rest of this. And there is time at the end for questions, but I just wanted to throw that out there. So you might have noticed throughout this presentation, there's been kind of a common theme, which is really think about what you want out of a transaction, think about what you want for your business, and don't act on a whim. And with respect to applicable local, state, and federal regulations, it's the same concept. Think about what kind of business you have, think about what might apply to you, and then figure it out. That all being said, this list on here is not exhaustive. It's just kind of a sampling of things that might apply to you. For example, the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. If you're handling medical records, you have to think about the privacy of those records, how to safeguard those records, and what happens if, for example, there's a data breach and health records go out. The Federal Americans with Disabilities Act, it forbids discrimination based on disability. If you are an employer, you might have to think from the employer's employment standpoint, what does this law mean for me? Well, if you're catering to the public, for example, you're running a small motel, you might have to think about ADA accommodations for your clientele. Chicago Health Code requirements for food establishments. There's a link there. Obviously, if you're handling food, there are special requirements there. And then regulatory bodies. Most licenses are regulated by some kind of regulatory body. For example, with us lawyers, we're regulated by the Illinois ARDC. The Illinois Department of Financial and Professional Regulation also regulates many different, missing the word, many different lines such as doctors, masseuses, brokers, things like that. They have 4 main divisions: the Division of Banking, the Division of Financial Institution, Division of Professional Regulations, and Division of Real Estate. And last but not least, obviously with everything that's going on with COVID, we've seen it on the news, the governor's constantly sending out new executive orders. We have a link later on in our presentation to the governor's executive orders, but do look at that. Generally, if you're a business, if you're running a meeting, there are general guidelines and in fact executive orders that you should be looking at, aware of, and following. So just pointing your attention to that. Melanie, if you don't mind hitting the next slide. Now, we are not insurance brokers, so first and foremost, we would refer you to an insurance broker for any of your insurance needs. That all being said, we do see what goes wrong a lot of the times and what insurance policies generally might kick in. So I have here a non-exhaustive list of insurance policies. Workers' compensation. What if your employee is injured on the job? What do? Well, you by law have to have a workers' compensation policy for your paid employees, as that term is legally defined. Commercial liability insurance. What if someone comes into your store and falls and they decide, oh my gosh, I have $500,000 in medical bills? Well, I would hope you have insurance for that. Property insurance, your building burns down. Business interruption insurance. This was huge when there was a lot of looting going on with the aftermath of various cases here in the US. And a lot of the times what was happening was a business was interrupted. They could no longer run their business, whether because their windows were smashed or whatnot. And they looked to their business interruption insurance for that. Cyber liability insurance is getting huge nowadays. There is a lot of hacking out there. There's a lot of social engineering where someone pretends to be your employer, for example, and they might contact the accountant and say, hey, I need you to transfer over $500,000, and thinking that the person asking for that is the employer. They do it, and then they realize, oh my gosh, all my money is gone. So that's been a very, very hot line of insurance. Auto insurance, if your company is requiring your employees to drive a car, that's something you might want to look into. Liquor liability if you serve alcohol in your premises. Fidelity insurance is something people often don't think about until it's too late. Fidelity insurance generally covers things like employee dishonesty. If I hire Ivy and I've worked with her for 10 years and I trust her and I gave her access to all of my books, and one day Ivy disappears, and before I know it, I realize that I've given her the corporate credit card, yet she has gone wild and has taken out $500,000 of random purchases, and she's gone. Who do I look to for insurance? Well, I'd be looking at my Fidelity insurer. And then professional liability insurance. If you practice anything with a license, if there is any chance of errors or omissions, you definitely want professional liability insurance. I assure you, all three of us attorneys do have our malpractice insurance here. And then last but not least, lawsuits or demands. If you are served with a lawsuit or written demand or even an oral demand, your first stop is to look at your insurance policies, talk to your insurance broker, and figure out who to give notice to. And if you're not sure if something is covered or not, give it to everyone, even though it might impact your premium. And the reason for that is that most insurance policies do have a notice provision. If you are late, the insurance company might be able to say, hey, listen, you were so late, I was prejudiced, I am no longer contractually bound to help you. Next slide, please. And Xiang, I'm going to turn it back over.
Sure, thanks. So I'm going to cover the next two slides, and I think they're kind of generally under the umbrella of commercial contracting. So these two slides cover kind of how you govern the relationship with different people that you might work with or encounter in the course of running a business. So there would be your vendors, contractors and any subcontractors, employees or independent contractors, customers or clients, and the general public. Next slide, please. So we're not going to go into too much detail on specifics of contracts, but important things to remember are that to kind of keep a copy of each of those contracts. This is sort of like how lawsuits start, when people have different understandings of what happened, and the best protection you can have is to keep copies of any contracts you sign, no matter how big or how small, with anyone you might encounter in the course of running your business. So vendors, customers, clients. Make sure we understand and read everything before you sign. And if you don't, consult a lawyer. And then for really big transactions, have enough detail and have enough specificity so that everyone's kind of on the same page with something. So this is kind of a silly example, but if I signed a contract to paint a house, and the painter showed up and gave me a canvas painting with a house like the one behind me, I might not be able to sue because it was a one-line sentence. It just said paint a house, and they're like, well, I painted a house. It's on a piece of paper. So that sort of thing, I know it's kind of jokey, but that's the sort of root of a lot of contract disputes. The specific contract provisions that we're not going to cover in too much detail, but that come up in contracts are non-disclosure provisions. So you can't reveal anything about this contract. I can't reveal anything. Privacy policies, which are similar. Purchase orders, which are usually pretty standard, but you'll see a terms and conditions at the bottom often. It's important to understand those. And then indemnity and liability. So that shifts the liability from one person to another. That's usually in the form of, if you get sued, then I agree to cover you if it was related to this contract. Next slide, please. And I'll turn it back to Jean for discuss employees.
Sorry for interrupting, Sean. So these are just general considerations that we ask you to think about if you're thinking about employing anyone. Will you be employing independent contractors, or will you actually have employees? People choose to do different things for different reasons. We've seen with the rise of technology that people like to use independent contractors a little bit more. For example, if you've been tracking any of the Uber disagreements, in California, for example, Uber was trying to classify its employees as independent contractors to avoid paying payroll taxes and workers' compensation premiums. And of course, the employees wanted the opposite because they wanted some of these premiums paid for. Immigration status is something definitely to keep an eye on with respect to anyone you might be potentially employing. Minimum wage, hourly employees, and break time. And I'll talk a little bit about that in the next slide, but minimum wage requirements, Illinois minimum wage requirements, I believe are changing again January 1st. Hourly employees, you have to pay attention to when they are entitled to break and to make sure that they take that break. Same thing with overtime. And this is something that is easily Googleable, just to figure out, okay, well, under the federal and state requirements, what do I have to be paying my employees? Other things to consider. Will you be having an employee handbook? What are your policies? Very often what we will see is, as far as the, oh no, something went wrong, an employer might be inconsistently allowing employees to do different things. And one employee might be really unhappy that he did not get the same benefit that his coworker did. Well, sometimes what employers will do is they'll think ahead of time and they'll think, okay, why don't I put together a policy or a handbook that talks about how I'm going to handle certain situations. Employment agreements, a lot of the times employees will sign employment agreements with their employers, talks a little bit about the scope of work, what's required, how they're being paid, and also sometimes covers non-competes and non-disclosure agreements. Non-competes being that you won't go next door to a competing business and give them business. Non-disclosure agreements being more so, okay, well, I have proprietary information, I have secrets of this company, I'm not going to go out there and flaunt it around. Next slide, please. So some timekeeping considerations, as I mentioned, the Illinois Minimum Wage Act, here's the link to it. It requires that employers pay a minimum of $10 per hour for workers 18 years and older. This is going up to, I believe, $11 on January 1st. Meals and break time that I just covered a little bit earlier. How to maintain time. This becomes a big issue when there is no consistency or when your time records are not properly kept. I'm, for example, dealing right now with a pretty big class action because we had a supervisor for one of my clients that decided that she was going to write down time whenever she wanted. And the employees came back and they said, well, listen, supervisor did not write down when I actually walked in the building, and that's actually when I was supposed to get paid. In fact, she had a clipboard, and we're fighting it out in court. So really think about, if you have employees and these are hourly employees, how will you maintain their time and how will you do so accurately so that there is no question? And this goes into Department of Labor audits. If, for example, the Department of Labor decides that, oh, there's reason to suspect something, or they want to look further into your timekeeping mannerisms and your timekeeping records, they can do that. So you better make sure that you have all your T's crossed and your I's dotted, because they will look into your records. What a lot of companies do is they employ third-party payroll companies that will run, you know, okay, I have to take off X taxes and there are these withholdings. That might be a method that you would want to consider. And one law that is unique to Illinois, it's starting to trend towards kind of various variations throughout the country, is the Illinois Biometric Information Privacy Act. This law is a little concerning from the employment perspective, especially when I flip through a Costco ad and I see that Costco is selling, for example, a time clock that uses employees' fingerprints to keep track of time for like $400. And the average small business owner might open that ad and say, oh, this is perfect. My employees will be able to clock in and out accurately. I won't have to deal with, oh, I forgot, because the time clock is right there. Well, unfortunately, employers everywhere are getting dinged for the Illinois Biometric Information Privacy Act, because under this act, whenever you take biometric information such as someone's fingerprints, you have to have written notice, you have to have the written consent, and you have to have various policies in place to safeguard this information, and you have to relay those policies out. Well, the Illinois Supreme Court has said if you don't follow these rules promulgated under this Illinois Biometric Information Privacy Act, you're more or less strictly liable. The Illinois Wage and Payment Collection Act generally governs the payment of wages to employees and the deductions that an employer can make from an employee's paycheck. Generally, employers may deduct when required by law, such as taxes, the benefit of the employee, such as health insurance premiums, union dues, things like that, and a valid wage assignment or wage deduction order is in effect made with the express written consent of the employee. Now, record keeping wise, generally the rule in Illinois is 3 years. And there's something else that recently came about. I believe it's under the Illinois Wage Payment and Collection Act. And the general rule is that if you are requiring your employee, for example, to print out a bunch of stuff to do their work at home, you need to be reimbursing that employee for that. So just something to be aware of. And next slide, please. Now, one consideration that a lot of small businesses think about is, how do I market my services? How do I advertise to the people that I want to advertise to? And there are different rules in place depending on where you are geographically and where you want to market to that you have to consider. For example, the GDPR, which really emerged out of the European Union, and the CCPA, the California Consumer Protection Act, talks about whether or not you will be retaining personal information. And that is very broadly defined under both of these laws, but it's kind of caused a whirlwind in the marketing department because if, for example, well, let me back up. A lot of the times I might be on Nordstrom.com looking at my favorite pair of shoes. And I might be looking for 3 minutes one day, 3 minutes the other day. And before I know it, I'm on Facebook, and that Nordstrom ad for that pair of shoes strangely shows up on my Facebook. That's because they're tracking my consumer habits. Well, a lot of small businesses might think, oh, that's a great way for marketing. But now you have to look at the GDPR and the CCPA and think about, oh, are there concerns I need to be thinking about from that perspective? Am I violating any of these cannot collect personal information statutes? So that's just something to keep in the back of your mind. Other consumer protection statutes, and we see these come up, unfortunately, a lot in lawsuits, the Illinois Consumer Fraud and Deceptive Businesses Practice Act. Let's say I'm selling, I don't know, I'm selling a cup, and I put on my website that this is the best cup in the world and you'll never drink better water in the world. And Xiang decides to buy my cup based on my representations. And he's like, this water is terrible. How could they ever say this is the best water in the world? My cup also, by the way, happened to cost $300. I've now been ripped off $300. He might decide to bring an action against me and my company under the Illinois Consumer Fraud and Deceptive Business Practice Act. Just something to keep in mind. Don't misrepresent when you are marketing, because there are consequences, and there are people out there that unfortunately look for opportunities like this and will file suit. Now we're going to move on to the next slide. We are nearing the end of our presentation here. Melanie, if you don't mind. And obviously at the forefront of many business owners' minds is COVID considerations. So Xiang is going to talk a little.
Sure. Yeah. So I mean, we're running short on time, but just very quickly. So I think we're all aware that there are some programs out there for COVID-related assistance for small businesses, and we've provided some links here, and this presentation will go out to everyone. So I don't want to cover these in too much detail, but the caveat here is that these things are constantly changing. As I think everyone knows, there's really been nothing at the federal level since the spring, and that maybe or might not change at some point soon. But at the city and state level, there are some ongoing programs, some specifically for certain industries like hospitality, and the city has a pretty useful webpage that they're updating somewhat regularly about what small business relief resources there are available at the city level. So I think everyone's going to try to keep updated on what's available, but this is something that's changing regularly, and it's important to consider not just government, but also non-governmental resources as well. Next slide, please. I'll turn it back to Jean on other COVID issues.
Yeah, so I mentioned earlier the governor's executive orders. Just by way of example, I had a client who operates a national company, and he had a meeting that a bunch of executives were flying into, and it was something that they really wanted to do in person. The headquarters was in Illinois, and he had a question for me. Could I host this meeting of 30 people? Well, at that time, there was guidance with respect to in-person meetings, how much capacity, things like that. And it wasn't so much a legal question, but it was requiring analysis of the executive orders. And what I ended up having to do, because if you have read these executive orders, sometimes they reference each other. Oh yes, this is all in place except refer back to executive order 15. I essentially had to piece it together and figure out, okay, can he do this and can he not? That all being said, this is constantly changing. If you are in a situation like that, I highly recommend that you literally trace the dots and figure out, okay, what is controlling right now? Back to work considerations is huge for so many people. And the truth is, there's not a lot of case law on this. In fact, there's none, because COVID is somewhat new to our legal landscape. But what we've generally told people is, don't be sloppy. It sounds very simple, but what that means is really look at what guidances are available. The CDC guidances, your local guidances, your state guidances. You don't want to be in a situation where everyone is telling you, hey, if you're within 1 foot of someone, you better wear a mask. And you tell all your employees, go mask free. It's great. I mean, it's just kind of common sense from that perspective. But, you know, sometimes we do have situations like this 20 or 30 person meeting. And the questions you have to ask yourself are, how big is your meeting room? Do they have to go one direction down a hallway, or are they crammed together? Things like that are definitely things you want to think about. Next slide, please. So I'm going to turn it over to Ivy to conclude. Ivy, do you mind stepping in?
So basically, the key takeaway is that there are no one-size-fits-all legal documents or solutions. So please talk to an attorney about the specifics of your situation and before you make a decision or sign something. If the businesses face any disputes, make sure that you contact your insurance, because a lot of times there is a required notice period, so that they can cover you, and find an attorney to respond as soon as possible, because there's usually always a response within a certain day deadline as well.
I'm going to add something really quickly to the find an attorney ASAP. I agree that we should be finding an attorney ASAP, but please keep your insurer involved. Because there are consent provisions sometimes, if you decide to act quickly and you're like, okay, I'm going to hire Jean today and I'm going to have her file all these responses because everything's due in a week, and then you wait a week to tell your insurance company, that might not seem like a lot of time, but it might have taken me hours and hours of research, writing stuff up. I might have billed you a couple $1,000s, and guess what? The insurance company is going to say, well, I never consented to that. Or what if my fees were extremely high for some reason? I promise they're not, but what if they were? And the insurance company says, well, I would have paid someone much less money than you paid Jean. There's no way I'm gonna cover that. So I would keep your insurance company involved at all times. If for some reason there was a deadline tonight and the insurance company has not come back to you, document that to the best of your ability and say something like, because there's a deadline tonight, we are retaining an attorney to respond specifically to this, whether to buy time, which is preferred if you can, or otherwise. But it's just because there are consent provisions in place, you just have to be careful. Otherwise, there's a chance that you're going to get stuck footing the bill. So that brings us just, I think, 2 minutes past our hour. We did address a couple questions in the chat, but if anyone has anything else, Tommy, I don't know if you have anything in the Q&A. If you want to step in.
Yeah, so on behalf of the Illinois SBDC at CMA, thank you so much to Chinese American Bar Association for this really wonderful, informative presentation. This was really great and really addressed a lot of questions and concerns that our clients have. If anyone has any follow-up questions, please email them to me, and I'll also be sending out the recording and presentation later today. So we'll make sure to include CABA's information as well. But with that, thank you so much, everyone, for attending today. Really appreciated everyone's feedback, insight, and hope you guys have a wonderful day. And thank you so much again to our superstars from CABA today.
Thank you.